Hello, everyone. There are still people entering the webinar, but I think we should make a start. Welcome to the Health Behaviour Change Project webinar series for this year. This is the fifth one in the series, and I'd like to welcome back people who've been to some before and to welcome people who are new to it. Today, we're going to be talking about what are ontologies and what they can be used for. I am Mary Johnston from the University of Aberdeen. I'm a behavioural scientist, and my colleague is...
I'm Jana Hastings from the Universities of Zurich and St. Gallen. I'm a computer scientist and ontologist.
So the roles we're taking today is I'm the person who's asking the questions and Jana is the person who's answering. The format of we have today is we've got a recording of a conversation between Jana and me, and then we have 25 minutes for discussion. While you're watching, you've got opportunities for entering the discussion format. So first of all, if you have any questions, put them in the Q&A box. And when you see questions in the Q&A box, upvote any questions you want answered, and we'll answer the ones that are upvoted most first. But in addition, any thoughts or reflections you have, do put them in the chat box, because things that we don't necessarily get to deal with today, we will look at afterwards, and they're always useful for us. So in the discussion format, we'll answer as many of your questions as we can, and we'll keep a record of all the questions and share them, and they'll be shared on the Open Science Framework, and all of our work is shared on Open Science Framework. We record every webinar in the series, and all of the recordings are going to be uploaded onto YouTube, and they'll be available on Open Science Framework. And you'll get a link to the recording and the webinar slides by email. Okay, so let's have the recording first, and then we'll have the discussion after the recording.
Hi, my name's Mary Johnston. I'm a behavioural scientist, and in this recording, I'm going to have a conversation with Jana Hastings, who's an ontologist. And this is a great opportunity for me because as a behavioural scientist, I'm aware of some of the problems we have in behavioural science. And I'm also aware that people have suggested ontologies might provide some answer to that. So over the years, with Susan Michie and with other behavioural scientists, we've been trying to make sense of how we communicate about the interventions we do to change behaviour. And there are problems in these communications, and there are problems in synthesizing the evidence. So in our communications, we have problems that we use the same word for different things, and we use different words for the same things, the jingle jangle problem. We don't communicate effectively because we're not using the same words. We have a problem that we have a vast literature, which we are having problems in organizing because we don't use the same words. And when you come to synthesize evidence, how do you know which papers to put together? How do you know which ones belong together? We need a way of organizing. Anyway, over the years, we've tried various ways of sorting this out. And now we've come to the point where we think that ontologies might be useful. But I'm going to have a conversation with Jana in which she'll maybe explain to us why ontologies might be helpful. So let's just start right at the beginning, Jana. What is an ontology? What might be helpful in solving some of these problems?
So in their essence, ontologies are very simple. They're collections of definitions for things that we can agree on. And then there's a lot of other things that you add on top of that. So you start with a collection of definitions, and then you can add labels, which people use to refer to those things. And you can add hierarchy and classifications and other relationships which help you to really understand how these different things fit together. And the way that this seemingly simple thing helps is it gives you this external reference for when things are the same thing, if they map onto the same definition. And you can use this external reference to sort of hook all your other things to it. So you can hook your evidence to it by saying what things you were studying, by connecting that up with one of these definitions. So the key ingredient is really just very simple, a sort of specification of entities, and an entity can be anything that you can study or be interested in or want to communicate about, in a way that lets you agree when you're talking about the same entity. That's the key ingredient. Now, on top of this, we add a whole lot of other things like making these specifications computable so that we can use them in computer programs that help to sort of do things at scale, you know, over large scale bodies of evidence, and other useful attributes. But in their essence, it's a very simple thing. Agreed definitions of entities.
But that sounds to me quite like just a theory, you know, something like the theory of planned behavior. It's a very simple construction which defines the constructs and the relationships between them. What way is that different? What way is an ontology different?
So I think that in a way, you could think of an ontology as a kind of theory, but the difference is that ontologies aim to be completely generic, really just picking out what are the entities and not to make specific claims in the way that theories usually do about the entities. So the purpose of ontologies is to provide, in a way, theory neutral as far as possible, descriptions of entities so that you can be sure you're talking about the same thing. Whereas specific theories usually try to say something more than that. Ontologies are in a way more modest than theories. Theories usually want to organize a view of the world, a particular perspective on how things are interrelated and their attributes. And the reason that you can't easily integrate at the level of theories when you want to look across multiple different studies and the whole body of evidence is quite simple, that people have different theories and people use these different theories to analyze and interpret their findings, but this doesn't help you to integrate across the findings which are arising from these different theoretical perspectives. You need a translation, you need an interlingua, something which can say, okay, this evidence, even though it was gathered from the perspective of this theory and is interpreted in the context of this theory, it's still about this thing. And the thing that it's about, we can understand in different ways in different theories. And that kind of bridging, that's the ontology level.
But won't people say, but this is just another theory, so why should we give up our theory, which we thought was the best theory, for your ontology, which you say is something different?
Yeah, exactly, because you don't have to give up your theory. It's only a translation. It's not a replacement. And I think that's the key part. So all you're doing by hooking up your research from its theoretical perspective, by hooking it up to an ontology, you're making it possible to translate it into other perspectives. You're providing this reference point for a common language.
So should it allow the possibility, would the ontology help us to say, if you're using the theory of planned behavior and I'm using the common sense self-regulation model and you're using the HAPA, this will allow us to say that's the same as that was in that, or that's related to that. Does it help us to translate between the theories?
Exactly, that's exactly the idea. So by having this kind of external common reference, which doesn't contain the theoretical statements, but only these kind of core definitions, which are theory neutral and which allow you to then translate. If you hook those up to the different theories, you can then say which parts of which theory are related to which parts of which other theory by virtue of being about the same sort of entity.
The thing that still puzzles me, though, is you're still talking about the relationships between entities. And that's what we do when we create a taxonomy. So that there are lots of taxonomies, and we've created a taxonomy of behavior change techniques. In what way does an ontology differ from a taxonomy? How does it go beyond a taxonomy, or is it just the same?
So ontologies usually have taxonomies in them. Descriptions of entities and their definitions it does help to arrange them from the general to the most specific. So this is, let's say, the backbone of entity definition. and including also the backbone of entity definition in ontologies. So ontologies have taxonomies as a part, bearing in mind that the way that entities are defined in ontologies is with this proviso that you try to do it in the most generic way possible, whereas taxonomies, you can do them in lots of different ways, and you could do, you know, taxonomies which were not very reusable, whereas ontologies, you aim for this reusability. But yeah, it's not a different sort of thing. It's more about understanding where the taxonomy fits in, and it's part of the ontology.
In taxonomies, usually the lower level item or entity is one of the ones above. Are there other relationships in ontologies other than this lower level thing is one of the upper level things?
Absolutely. So ontologies have not only taxonomic relationships, which arrange things in the sequence where the lower level things have all the properties of the ones that they're classified beneath, but ontologies can have other sorts of relationships. For example, you can have parthood relationships, you can have attributes and the things that they're attributes of being related. You can have relationships between processes and their participants. So there's a whole wide range of sort of ways that entities can be related, and you can capture these formally in ontologies.
Could you give me an example of a process having a relationship with its participants?
Sure. Well, an intervention has participants, and that's the most straightforward example, I guess, because an intervention is a process. It happens, it occurs in time, and the participants join in, or I guess there are other participants in the process as well. Maybe the people who are delivering the intervention are participating in a different way to the people who are receiving the intervention. So you have some complexity there. But
so the relationship would be these participants receive this intervention rather than these participants are part of this intervention.
Absolutely, yeah. It would be a different relationship that would let you sort of capture the way that these things are related, and this lets you reason about them a bit differently because parts have different properties too.
And how do we decide what entities we're going to have in our ontology?
So this is a good question which doesn't have a definite answer one way or another. It's a heuristic. The objective is to serve the community, to provide the vocabulary that's needed in order to integrate the evidence. So in a way, it's driven by the scenario, it's driven by the use case, it's driven by the evidence, it's driven by what people are researching about or what they are needing to describe for their practice. So you sort of get your requirements not from a priori or theoretical sort of grounds, but rather from what is needed in practice.
And if we get to a point where we're agreed what the entities are that we need, what happens if somebody wants to call them something different? So instead of calling them participants, they call them patients. Instead of calling them patients, they call them children. What happens then? We have problems with, we've got the same entity, but people are calling it different things.
Yeah, so this is exactly the problem that ontologies are designed to solve. And the way that they solve it is by having this organizing principle of the definition. And then they have what's called a semantics-free identifier associated with that definition. So you use that identifier as the core referent, and you can label it differently in the different contexts. So you can have one label for your first group of people who want to call it participants, and another label for your other group of people who want to call it patients. And by the way, the primary driving reason for this is not even different labels for different communities, but different labels for different languages. If you think about it, many of the standards which are developed, which are oriented around labels, are kind of unfair to people who are actively using different languages in their work. But yes, so the idea is that you have these definitions, and then you have this non-label, which is the identifier, and this is the thing you really use, but then you associate it with the label that works best for your context.
So where's this identifier? Is the identifier just in somebody's paper, or how do we find that?
No, it's in the ontology, and the ontology in this sense is a document. It's a kind of formal, computable document which is stored in a place in the cloud usually, so that people can find it, and you can access it online, and you can look up these identifiers associated with definitions. And there are tools which allow, you know, easier access if you don't want to sort of read the whole document or process it. So there are websites which will show you what and allow you to search and things like this. But in its essence, the ontology is this document which contains the specifications.
The tricky bit for us is that there are already other kinds of ontologies that are relevant, so that the Cochrane collaboration has the PICO ontology, population, intervention, control and outcome. Why is that not enough?
So I think PICO is a very good ontology, and sort of started, I think, in this direction of using ontologies in evidence synthesis and helping to formalize these things in a way that, you know, you can disambiguate them and so on. But it doesn't contain really descriptions of the entities, such as specific types of, you know, population and so on. It doesn't have a very expanded catalog of entities within it. That's not its purpose, and it's not within scope. But you need this expanded catalog if you want to go to the level of really deciding which studies can be aggregated together with which other studies by virtue of whether they have comparable populations or whether they have comparable outcomes and so on. These really detail level questions, you need a detail level catalog to help you to start to answer. Whereas the PICO is more about clarity of the structure. So it's at a higher level.
So there's something here that I think we're beginning to talk about, is how one ontology relates to another. Are ontologies meant to relate to each other, or does each sort of sit in its own box?
Ontologies are absolutely meant to relate to each other. If you think about it, what we're doing when we build ontologies is we're sort of cataloging an aspect of human knowledge, human study, the world that we study. Now, it's good if a community does it for a particular domain, if that community knows about that domain, but no one community knows about all the domains and all the questions. This is just not how human sort of research and practice works. So ontologies need to fit together in such a way that overall they sort of, like bits of a jigsaw puzzle, you build up this bigger picture of all the different things, and each domain has some interfaces to other domains, and at those boundaries you have really close connections between the different ontologies.
So that's what we mean by interoperability, isn't it? That
Yeah.
If I have my ontology, it must link to other ontologies by sharing some almost receptors or common terms, something like that, like your jigsaw puzzle. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so supposing we've now got our ontology, and I want to go back to what the problem was. How does that solve our problem? How does that enable us to put evidence together?
So it needs to be used, and there are several different ways that the ontology can be used that are helpful. One way is if researchers, when they're reporting their studies, they can associate ontology identifiers really with the study description. That gives this unambiguous link, because study descriptions that are reported in free text, maybe using some rather specific language, will be difficult to interpret. But if that same language is then associated with this identifier, which links to this unambiguous ontology reference point, then you have this connection. So using the ontology in study descriptions is a key important ingredient. Another important ingredient is all the things that ontologies can do to help computers help people. So for example, if you use the ontology in algorithms which automatically process large bodies of literature, you can start to be in a position where these algorithms can generate some kind of automated synthesis around the structure of the ontology and the entities in it. And this is super useful. Another and more subtle and maybe more hard to define way that ontologies help is that they bring communities together around thinking about these kind of definitions. And this is really important because the aim and the objective in agreeing about these kind of theory neutral entity definitions, the aim is to arrive at the essence of things in such a way that it reduces disagreement. And most of the sort of definitional arguments that take place in communities that are not structured around this kind of ontology, they tend to be fruitless disagreements.
I think you're describing a glorious future in which we all use the same language. We write our papers in the language. The computer can pick up the evidence from our papers because we've used the same language and integrate the data, and that's all done, and we can sit back and enjoy the results. But we already have a massive literature, and I know that people are using various ways of annotating literature. So you go back and you read the literature and you've got to do all of this work. Is there something we can be doing that helps us to synthesize the evidence we already have rather than creating a literature that is better for the future?
Well, I think there's two things here. One of them is these algorithms that I mentioned and the extent to which we can get them to work really well. And of course, this is something which people are working on in order to sort of use computers to do annotations of the literature for us and then benefit from that retroactively. And the other thing is really having this work of doing annotations when computers can't do it and it has to be done manually. It's really important that we don't do this over and over. So we need some sort of repository where such annotations can be shared, where the knowledge that's built by applying this kind of structure to retroactively to literature papers itself can be shared so that we don't have to do it individually over and over again.
So you're saying things like that the computer would be able to identify where the participants are in the paper, and it wouldn't require a human to do that.
To some extent. So this algorithms to do this have been developed in the context of the Human Behavior Change Project, and they work with a certain level of accuracy, and then you need real humans to fill the gap. Mm-hmm. So you need both.
So what you're saying begins to deal with the quantity of literature that we have. I think if we achieve what you're talking about, we can get over jingle jangle because we've got a way of translating between terms, and that all seems very helpful. Are there things that you think that behavioral scientists should be thinking about in approaching ontologies? Is there advice you'd give us about the kind of things we tend to get wrong about ontologies? You've been working with us for some time now. You know how we get it wrong.
I think the main thing to understand is really this relationship between an entity definition that is as atheoretical as possible, so that it just really picks out what are we talking about, regardless of what we're trying to say about that thing. And then, because I think behavioral scientists are very trained to sort of look through the lenses of theories and then to lack a common referent. So I think this is the thing that I would say the most, that the purpose of ontologies is just to get to a point where we can agree what we're talking about and when we're talking about the same thing.
So my analogy is that we're trying to get behavioral science up to the stage that Linnaeus got botany centuries ago. Is that where we are?
Well, I think that I'm not sure it's quite the same, but yeah, these catalogs are important. These catalogs of reference, they are important.
Can I just thank you very much for answering all of these questions that all of us behavioral scientists have? I think the Human Behavior Change Project has taught us a lot about our discipline and how our discipline can benefit from another discipline such as yours. So thank you very much for these comments. Really nice to talk to you.
Interesting discussion. Likewise.
Hi, everyone. Thanks, Jana, for answering all these questions in the session there. Can I encourage people who have questions to put them into the Q&A? And we're going to start with the questions in the Q&A that have been upticked most. And there's one that's got a lot of votes from Karen Porter. Who agrees the definitions? Is there a neutral third party that would, for instance, say which term was the right one to use? I'm thinking of self-determination theory and the theory of needs. The first uses terms autonomy, competence, and relatedness. The second uses power, achievement, and affiliation. There's a prima facie case that they're talking about the same thing. Who agrees the definitions? Jana, would you like to?
Shall I start? Shall I start with that one? So yeah. I think this is a really complex question that goes to the heart of how ontologies can be useful for a community. And the bottom line is that the whole community needs to agree the definition. So building an ontology is a consensus building activity. If the ontology has to serve the community, then it needs to get agreement from the whole community. So there are processes to go through to sort of make sure that that happens and that what you end up with is representative for people. But the specific example where you have different terms coming from different theories and some argument that they may or may not refer to the same thing, I think this is nevertheless not the question that the ontology would be concerned with. So the ontology wouldn't say which term was the right one to use. It would only offer a definition which the community could agree to, and then sort of make note of the fact that different terms were used in these different theories to refer to that thing which is defined. Does that make sense, Mari? What's your take on this?
Yeah, and in addition, supposing you have these two theories and they're looking at the definitions, it is the definition that matters. And it's quite possible that in the theory of needs, people would want to refer to this definition as relatedness, whereas in the self-determination theory, they'd want to call it affiliation. That would work perfectly well. The other possibility is that what they're saying is some slight variation on that, in which case they would be able to provide another definition which would sit alongside as a sub-variation of the whatever we call the overriding relatedness affiliation. So that it's all very explicit in the definitions. The other big thing, I think, is this, the way in which ontologists write definitions. They try to reduce it to the essence of the thing, not what caused the thing or what the consequences of the thing are or the implications of the thing. And most of the definitions we have in psychology have more than just the thing itself. The embedding in the theory says where it's come from and where it's going to. So for example, when we've been working on the behavior change techniques ontology, our definitions said that these were things that were designed to change behavior. That doesn't describe the thing. That says what purpose it might be put to. So just quite recently, we've had that taken out of all our definitions because it wasn't a good ontological definition. So there's a way of learning to write definitions that don't have this assumptions behind them. The other part of this, Jana has talked about how there's this consensual process. So when we're developing ontologies within the Human Behavior Change Program, we do start off with what people have said in the literature, and we start with that. We look for definitions anywhere we can find them. So we look at dictionary definitions, academic definitions, everything, and we bring that in. And then we have lots of discussions amongst the team. But in addition, all of our work goes out to stakeholders to comment on it and to revise them. The other thing that I found really quite compelling about ontologies, which is part of all of this, is that they're never fixed on stone. They're always open for change. And one of the things that I found really hard during the Human Behavior Change project is that we're always changing. I think we're always improving. But even when an ontology is published, the definitions can be upgraded, and there would always be an explicit record of what had happened to the definition, and that would be out there. Is that all vaguely correct, Jana?
Yeah, absolutely. So they're evolving, they're sort of living structures. They're not intended to be set in stone the way that some classification systems are set in stone. And that's actually this living, it allows you to sort of keep up with the fact that research changes, topics change, people invent new ways of looking at things, which actually may allow clearer research to take place in the future. So there's definitely a need to keep growing and changing the ontology if it's going to stay current.
There's another question that's related to definitions. So that previous one was from Karen Porter. This one's from Michelle S. I've read a few definitions in ontology that actually make me more confused about what a word means. Maybe this is a silly question. No questions are silly in this domain.
Yeah.
Why aren't they worded like the words in the dictionary?
Yeah. So this is a good question, and they are actually different things. So you're not, when you're making an ontology definition, there's two things to keep in mind. The first is that you're not defining what a word means. You're trying to pick out an entity that you can sort of describe unambiguously, that has a clear meaning. And this thing that you're trying to pick out, it's you want to do it in a way that people can agree on this entity being the same entity and not being another entity. But the other thing that makes, I think, ontology definitions maybe more confusing when you're not used to them is the fact that your ontology captures a network, a hierarchy of interconnected meanings. And when you're defining one entity within that interconnected network, you start from the parent. So you start from the definition, the way that the parent is defined. Without repeating the whole definition of the parent, you just say, go look there for that definition. Now we're just going to say how this one is different to its parent in a way that sort of captures the essence of how you would decide that thing was a thing of that type. Does that make sense?
There's a query under that question about the HBCP team would like to answer this question live. What's that about? Is a team?
What?
There's a query under that question about the HBCP team would like to answer this question live. Okay.
No.
We don't understand that. If we go on to another question, this is another really good question. I love these questions. How would you explain what an ontology is to somebody new to research? Are there any other less complex words that mean the same as ontology, which might be easier to understand? I agree with that. I do find it quite complex, but thank you for the session.
Yeah, so it's a complex word with a long history. But I do think that it's worth having a word on its own to mean what we're talking about when we talk about ontologies, and not repurposing a word that already sort of means something different. So in some sense, it's an advantage having a complex word, which then you can be really clear about what you're talking about. Of course, there are all sorts of other resources which gather and structure our knowledge. People talk about taxonomies we mentioned during the recording. People talk about knowledge structures, classification systems. There are, I guess, a lot of different words for very similar sorts of activities and things. I like the word ontology.
I've had to learn to like it, can I say? I think you have to follow up quickly with a kind of example in everyday terms. And ontologies are sort of organized way of structuring your knowledge and sharing your knowledge with someone else who can follow the same structure. And so the analogy I give you, when you go into a supermarket, you have an ontology about how the vegetables are organized. You know what's going to be frozen, canned, and you don't go to the frozen section for the canned, and you don't go to the canned for the frozen. And you are sharing an ontology with the vendor. They have a way of organizing their knowledge, and you share it. And it's very irritating, of course, if the supermarket doesn't share your ontology. But that's how I like to think about it, that you don't go into a supermarket with no idea where to look for things. And even a supermarket you've never been in before, you know, you're looking, you look in the frozen food section for the frozen vegetables, and you look in the canned section for the canned vegetables. And within the frozen section, you know that you're looking for whatever might be there. And you might have the same thing in the canned section, but you know it's different. Yeah. So that's the kind of analogy that I use to help people. And it also explains why it's valuable, because it means that I have a model of the world that I can share with someone. And that enables us to communicate.
That's right. That's right. So you have some sort of organizing structure, which you've agreed on, and that makes it easier for you to find things. Mm-hmm. But then you also have sort of common language for finding even if you don't use the organizing structure, right? You have like barcodes and things in supermarkets.
If definitions, so Fiona Lambie says, if definitions may always shift, isn't there a risk that they're causing more confusion within the community?
Yeah, so I think this, may I, Mari, is that all right? If I start, you can add. So I think this is a really interesting point. So they can always shift, but they have to shift for good reason. And I don't think that this would cause more confusion, because usually the sorts of reasons that definitions do end up shifting is because there has been confusion or some problem with the definition, or there's some evidence that it hasn't been usable in a consistent way. And then the community comes together to sort of find a solution for this problem. And that will lead to a change in the ontology, but it will be one which generates more confusion, less confusion, more progress away from confusion. Now, of course, it could happen the opposite way. And the objective of a good managed ontology development process would be to ensure that this wasn't the case, by ensuring that the community was involved in the process of evolution sufficiently to sort of make sure that confusion was avoided. What do you think, Mari?
I think this is actually quite hard work. Getting to this level, and what you find happening in the discussions, which I find quite reassuring, is that when there's the kind of disagreement, you kind of work back to what's the minimum, what's the maximum that everyone can agree on, and you don't go beyond that. And if you get into disagreement, you've probably just got to back up a little bit. And if you've got a hierarchical ontology, so for example, if you take all the different kinds of relatedness constructs that you have in all the different theories, they may all belong to a higher order relatedness construct. And if you can't agree on the lower level, you can probably agree it's all to do with something to do with relatedness and affiliation, or whatever you call the one above. So that kind of, you're probably going to get a good agreement on the definition of the upper level, even if you can't agree so well on the lower level.
That's right. And disagreement is a guide, isn't it? If there's disagreement and confusion, then something isn't clear to everybody. Something genuinely isn't agreed. So debates and disagreements are not necessarily in themselves bad. They provide information about what people are understanding. And sometimes people are understanding things quite differently. And this, reality may be hidden somehow if it's not foregrounded by a good ontological debate.
I hope I don't just come over as a convert to this, Hannah.
Oh no, maybe we need a devil's advocate in our in our midst.
Anna Soderlund asks, when we're defining entities rigorously, are we at the same time hindering our creativity for developing new understandings of entities?
Yeah, so I think this is an interesting question. So I think the question is, what happens that would lead you to understand an entity differently? And if that happens, what should you do then with the ontology? So as we mentioned before, the ontology is not a fixed, rigid structure. It evolves. It gets updated when understanding advances. And if this happens, that some new results or new way of thinking about things leads to a shift or a potential shift in our understanding of an entity, then potentially we would want to update the ontology. But I think it's quite rare that I'm not sure if this is creativity linked, right? This is kind of, you get some evidence. So there used to be the idea that there was one disease, diabetes, and then new evidence suggested that there were actually two different things. And then we ended up with type 1 diabetes, type 2 diabetes. This type of thing is an evolution of knowledge. Now, creativity, I think this comes in many different ways in the research process, but it's not as clear for me how this directly relates to understanding of entities. Mari, maybe you can inform me on this one.
The big thing for me is knowing the difference between creativity and rewording. And our discipline has tended to have apparent creativity that's really creating something like the same. And the example I always come back to is that, even in 1996, we had 100 different kinds of perceived control. But without proper definitions, we don't know if they were all different. And given how long ago that is, just think how many there are now. Is that creativity, or is that preventing ourselves from having a stable basis on which to have creativity? If we don't know what we have defined, if we don't know what evidence we do have, it can be false creativity that we're thinking as creativity. So my feeling about it is that it makes a more secure platform on which to be creative, because you've got a little bit more understanding and knowledge. You know what you know what you've defined, when you're saying something that's different. Whereas before we were kind of muddling along, I think. Well, we're probably muddling along for a long time yet.
Yeah, so I think there's really a need to know what you're proposing, when you look at something differently, are you really assigning a new definition to the same thing, or are you determining a new entity that hasn't been cataloged before, that you've just discovered or invented, or are you renaming something that maybe your name is better, but essentially was known about already before, right? And these are different scenarios which we should handle differently.
Okay, Dinara A asks, could you kindly name the IT tools which you use for the ontology? And I think the answer to that question is probably going to be on the 19th of April. There's going to be a webinar on exactly that topic. Would you like to just...
So I can give one very brief answer to that question. So I think the standard tool for developing ontologies, at least that's freely available for and not that you have to pay for, is called Protégé. It's a really good tool for developing ontologies. We don't use it. We developed custom tools, and these custom tools you may indeed hear more about during the webinar that Mari, you just mentioned.
Could you say for the people listening what the tools actually do for you? Because there are different tools do different things.
Yeah. So there's tools which allow you to, yes? There are tools which allow you to sort of add content to ontologies, and then there are tools that allow you to visualize what's in the ontology, or to search it, or to look things up, I guess, being one of the main uses. And we have Also, separately got tools which allow you to sort of make associations between ontology terms and bits of the evidence, so papers, or even to design studies and protocols referring to bits of the ontology.
The team has put the link for the 19th of April, the one on tools for using behavior change intervention ontology webinar on the 19th of April. That's in the chat now if you're interested. But the other part of that question is, I'd like to hear your opinion on AI application for ontology.
Yeah, so I can give only a very brief answer to that question. I think it's a broad topic, actually. So on the one hand, ontologies encode knowledge in computable form. This knowledge can be fed into some of the approaches to AI. For example, there are all kind of knowledge graph-based AI algorithms which make predictions. So this is why companies like Amazon have huge teams of ontologists which are capturing knowledge so that they can use them in their AIs that recommend what we buy next. And then on the other hand, there's AI which sort of uses ontologies to do other things. And here I think for one example would be our own human behavior change project developed AI to predict the outcomes of smoking cessation interventions. So sort of taking the evidence, feeding that into an AI system together with the ontology and making predictions from that. But there's lots more to say, which we cannot cover in this short time.
Would you like to give a quick something about the reservations on using AI, limitations?
Reservations and limitations, oh yes. So I think your model is only as good as the data it's been trained on, and then its own sort of biases and limitations. And many of the problems that we have with computational systems doing things come from the fact that our data is not representative and contains many biases. And as soon as you feed these biases into an AI system, you kind of amplify them, you increase the reach and impact that the biases can have. So there are lots of potential problems which have to be guarded against by careful design. But I think that ontologies at least give you the possibility to offset these problems, because you at least have clear descriptors for things like population characteristics. So you can at least see, how you're doing in terms of those characteristics.
There's another question in the chat from the same person about retrieving information from databases. It wasn't a question, it was something that was being pointed out to us. But if people are interested in using ontologies for retrieving information from databases, they might want to go back to, I think it's the second webinar in the series on the 15th of March, where some of that was dealt with. So if anyone else is interested in using ontologies to retrieve information. Okay, so the next one comes from Paul Ekblom. Regarding the ongoing evolution of ontologies as learning engines, which continuously track developments in a research domain, does anyone draw on Piaget's concept of adaptive learning, which distinguishes assimilation, squeezing a new entity to fit the existing, and accommodation, adding a distinct new entity or splitting existing one and two? This is something you find useful.
So this sounds like a research paper which just has to get written about how ontology evolution is a community process of learning as viewed through Piaget's concept of adaptive learning, as opposed to an individual, right? So it's the ontology represents some kind of consensus of a community, and yet the evolution of the ontology may parallel these processes. I think this will be fantastic. But I guess the short answer is no, we haven't applied that way of thinking about, or at least I haven't.
No, but I don't think that one would think about squeezing to fit an existing ontology. I actually think what you'd be doing there would be perhaps creating new things that link to that ontology. You might be thinking about better definitions for things that are within that ontology. And for accommodation, very often what you're doing there is producing subclasses of the higher class to accommodate the different kinds of entities. So my feeling is that the idea of adding a distinct or splitting is more likely to be what's used. But yes, Jan and I are looking forward to writing that paper, Paul. Right. The next one is from someone anonymous.
We have one at the top of the list, which is, are ontologies just for evidence reviews, or are they used in all study types?
Go for it.
I think you can answer this one.
Right, this is about the general issue of what you can use ontologies for. We definitely think you can use ontologies for writing your grant applications, for defining what you're going to do, because they help you to specify more clearly in the same ways it would help the new supermarket owner to decide what the shelves should be in their supermarket. So that certainly my colleagues have been using ontologies for writing grant applications, because the ontology, by having all the entities in it, tells you all the things that you should be putting in there. Yes, they're important for evidence reviews because they allow you to bring evidence together because you've got things under the shared definitions. The other thing that I think we've been quite impressed by is how it sharpens your thinking. You can't waffle around if you've got precise definitions, and you know what belongs within what, and you know when there's a clash. The other thing that you know is when there's something absolutely missing. You know when something isn't being defined. So, for example, in 2013 we published Behavior Change Taxonomy. We didn't define what the groupings were. No ontologist would have done that. And we've gradually crept towards being closer to ontologists, so that it actually helps you to sharpen out your way of thinking, your way of describing the information you have. And that has impressed me quite a lot. Jana, do you want to comment on that too?
Yeah, I think it's really about this sort of idea that by looking at all the entities in their level of detail, you're prompted to think, should I include those? Should I not? It's kind of a guide, isn't it, to the overview of the domain within certain topic areas, which can then prompt you to think about things for your study design. And this works across different types of study. Of course, at the end, when you're doing the evidence synthesis, again, it's really helpful to have that level of detail kind of consistently captured, which if you capture it at the time that you're designing the study, you could then preserve it all the way through. And I think this would make the whole process a lot less painful than it is at the moment.
Actually, I'm currently being asked by people, how would you describe diversity in different populations? And my answer to that is, let's look at the population ontology that we've been developing, because that may help us, because it's a way of organizing the information. And that's particularly important if you're going across countries, that you want to be looking at what's the most basic way of describing populations that can work across countries and within countries. And of course, there'll be different levels within different countries, but we can all agree on the upper level of what we're talking about.
Yeah, so it's exactly, and you can have all the different ways of chopping up the population groups explicitly in the ontology. You don't have to just have the British one, right? Or just have the American one. You can have the British one and the American one. And, you've got all these different explicit definitions which say this population group is defined this way. And then you can see, oh, that's what they meant when they said, I always have to, in Britain, they have all these population groups questionnaires all the time that you have to fill in. And I don't fit because I'm not British, right? I'm South African. So I have to find, they don't have a box for me.
Yeah. I've actually got to sort of disobey our rule. There's a question further down about definitions change with time and geography. How do you account for this? I'd also add language. Is there a simple answer to that one?
To language?
Time and geography.
To how? Well, So with time, yes, we keep a kind of, each ontology has a current version and it also has historical versions. And if something changes, then you sort of have to make the change in the ontology as well. So the way that people think about certain things changes over time. And you have to keep your ontology up to date, but you have the historical version, so you can look back and say, oh, we defined this other, this other way in 1993 or whatever. With geography, I think this is more what we were just talking about, where you have potentially different ways of defining things coexist in the ontology because they are used in different places. And of course, then you just have to be clear. You've got your ID, which tells you this is one definition with this ID. This is another definition with this other ID, and they're different definitions, even if they're called the same thing.
I think we can end up being, the way we construct our ontologies, working from existing literature, which is in our disciplines very much biased towards Western English languages. We can end up with biases, and it's not so much their biases in the ontology, but there are things that are not there that will be added as other people join us. Okay, I'm rather concerned that we haven't dealt with the atheoretical. It strikes me as an oxymoron, and we're being prompted to close the webinar. Can I just say I really like the atheoretical, strikes me as an oxymoron. I'm going to dodge the column here. But we may be able to come back to that later on, because we do keep all the questions. So any further questions and comments, do send them to us, and scan this QR code, and it will allow you to get the link for what's in the chat box. Okay, so the next one in the series is next week, the 12th of April at 4 p.m. British Standard Time. British Summer Time, sorry, correct. And then they'll be introducing behaviour change intervention ontology, and it'll be led by Ella House, Alison Wright, Paulina Schenk, and Lisa Chang. But for today, can I just thank you very much for participating. If you want to find out more, these are the Twitter, GitHub, website, and publication links. If you're not quick enough to get that, you'll get it on the slides that you'll be able to get later. And the recordings of the previous webinars are all there. All of our work appears in Open Science Framework, so you should be able to find anything that you need somewhere in there. And if you can't, just put a note to us and it will be answered. Okay, is there anything I've missed, Jana?
I think that's it. Thank you so much, Mari. This was a really good discussion.
Very nice to talk to you, and thank you for all your leadership on ontologies for us behavioural sciences. Thank you very much for everyone participating, and I hope to see you in a future webinar. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.